So you're wanting to start a podcast. You've got a very basic idea of your topic, but there seems to be so many different types of podcast. You can go solo, or have a co-host or two. You can record online or in person. You can have guests online or in person. You can have a long show or a short show. But what's the right format for you? Let's find out. Hi, I'm Dave, owner and editor at Bright Fox Audio, and I'm here to help you to get started. If you've been around the web for a while, you probably listen to podcasts already. And if you're thinking of starting one, you're likely a regular listener to podcasts and you're developing the urge to create your own. So the first format question, if you're trying to decide what kind of podcast to do, is do you want to do audio or video? Now, with video and podcasting, there is a bit of a resistance to it in traditional podcasting spaces. You'll get people saying it's impossible to be a video podcast, that's got to be something else. But video has actually been part of podcasting spec since the early days. But because the internet didn't support it, they were rare and unpopular. And devices like the iPod, from which the name podcast comes from, initially didn't even support video. Over the time, major shows like Joe Rogan have made the idea of video very closely tied to the concept of the podcast. So younger folks coming into the space often assume video when they think of a podcast. But video isn't always the right choice. There are, of course, technical aspects in the cost. There's camera equipment, lights, microphones, recording devices. There are a lot of things to take into account when you do video. And editing takes longer, and you need graphics, and there's other factors as well. You need to get up, you need to put on a nice shirt, you need to brush your hair, maybe you need to wear makeup. It's generally more onerous on you as a creator and as a host to be doing video content. Video also needs focus from the audiences, whereas audio doesn't. I've mentioned the resistance to video in old podcasting circles, and I'm one of those, to be honest. I mean, I won't say a video podcast isn't a podcast, but for me, a defining characteristic of a podcast is, can I do it while I'm driving? And you can't drive and watch YouTube. Audio also fails to me when it comes to giving instruction. It's hard to show people how to do things. And also, again, when I'm driving, it's not a great time to be trying to teach me anything. My hands and eyes are busy, and I'm focused on something more important. And I think this is often the case when people are listening to podcasts. They're doing chores or things in that vein, so they're not really focused on what you have to say. Videos tend to be shorter form because you need to hold people's attention, where audio can be more free form and conversational. And of course, I used the example of Joe Rogan earlier. He does 3-hour-long conversational podcasts, but you're not necessarily Joe Rogan. And of course, you can do both. You can do audio and video, but you need to consider the details very carefully. And of course, you can always expand later. You can start on audio, go to video, start on video, go to audio, to see how things go. In the rest of this episode, I'm going to focus on audio podcasting. But most of this advice can be considered with video. You just need to add an extra complication layer of cameras and looking nice for the camera. And even though I'm focusing mostly on audio podcasting, there is no harm in recording your chats and Zoom calls or whatever else for repurposing the content for promotional purposes, even if they're not going to be your main podcast. So the solo format. For some types of content, the solo podcast may be appropriate. It is a bit tricky though, because you need to be engaging enough by yourself to keep people listening. A solo podcast can be very hard without any kind of co-host or guest. Equipment is very cheap though. A USB mic plugged into your computer, or even a cheap lapel mic into your phone, and you're good to go. The next type of format, and a slightly more complicated but not by much, is having online co-hosts. In this day and age, probably the most common kind of podcast format is people getting together using an online service like Zoom, or hopefully something better, and recording that. Now, equipment-wise, this is pretty simple. The same USB mic you use for a solo podcast with headphones or earbuds are pretty much all you need. Absolutely no using your laptop speakers to hear people. Ever, 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 ever. End of story. This has most of the simplicity of the solo show, with the addition of interplay and banter. Because part of the fun of a podcast is the feel of sitting in on friends having a good chat. This is why parasocial relationships are a big thing with people in the podcasters they listen to. You do need to be careful that it doesn't become too messy. Not every friendly chat is going to be interesting to listeners, and as you get more people on, they tend to talk over each other and it can get unlistenable if you're not careful. The next sort of development from the online co-hosting format is interviews. Do you have access to a pool of interesting people you can get to online to chat for a podcast? Are you sure? Now, interview podcasts are a great format, but early on, it can be difficult to get people to speak to you. It gives you a boost to have people you can interview who believe you will be interesting for your audience. Now, Joe Rogan, again, as the example that a lot of people go to, got massive because he could get massive guests, but he was already fairly well known as a comedian and as the host of Fear Factor. So people knew him and they were interested to talk to him. If you don't have access to a large pool of people you can get online to interview regularly, you can have interviews as part of your standard solo or standard two-person show. Every now and then get a guest on, make it a little bit more interesting and a bit more rewarding for your listeners. Now, every now and then you get podcasts that have like 3, 4, 5, or 6 people on it. And in my experience, it's very, very difficult to listen to those. Group chats get untenable because there's just too much management, people trying to have their say, and people talk over each other, and it's very difficult to focus on. But maybe you have a bunch of people you want to get on, and you can do a panel show. You can have one host who drives the bus and keeps things in hand, but gives each person a chance to speak, and you can have a little bit of repartee and banter without things becoming a completely noisy mess. Now, for a lot of people, the ideal type of podcast is to record in person with others. Really fancy, well-known podcasts have guests in lavish studios, all talking around a table, usually into a very expensive microphone. So maybe this is what you're thinking of when you want to do a podcast. If it's going to be you and a single co-host, someone you know very well, this is very achievable. You can get a cheap interface or recorder or a couple of cheap microphones with stands, and you've got a great place to get started. If you're planning on a bigger group, then you'll need to spend quite a lot more on recording equipment. A 2-mic input interface is around $150 to $160. One with 4 mics is a lot more expensive. And if you want to be mobile, then you need a mobile recorder or a reliable laptop and the interface in question. Basically, once you're over 2 people in the same place, things do get expensive and complicated. Not to say don't do it. If that's what you want and you think you can do something great, please do it. But just bear in mind these considerations. You can also be flexible with your format. Have guests sometimes, be solo sometimes, have friends on sometimes, have live on location recording sometimes. A little bit of consistency is a good idea for listeners because they want to know what they will hear when they get started. But you can try out different formats and see how the audience reacts and what you like making, because that's also very important. As you're planning your podcast, think about the sort of content you want to put out and the people you want to share the journey with and who you can rely on. There is nothing worse than having a co-host who drops you a few episodes in when you're just starting to enjoy yourself. Believe me, I'm on Facebook groups for podcasting, and there is a lot of people getting dropped or finding unreliable co-hosts. So this is something you need to be careful of when you get started. And another consideration, of course, is budget. A decent USB microphone, like the one I recommend, Samson Q2U, is around $60. A 2-mic input interface is usually around $160. A 4-mic input is over $400. Portable recorders go up similarly in price as well. But whatever format you choose when you start, you can set yourself up for success by making sure your content is fun, engaging, and the best quality you can achieve. Know what you're talking about, enjoy what you're talking about, share your personality, and have fun. So I hope that's been useful to you. A little bit of food for thought for you to go forward while you're thinking about starting your podcast. Put a little bit of thought into it. Think about what you can afford and what you can achieve and the people in your network that you can rely on to help you. And go out there and make something cool.